All right, so I got a story here that is really honestly one of the most predictable stories of the entire pandemic, and we're going to get into some of the details as to how exactly they're raising their prices. But listen, if you've been following my coverage throughout this pandemic, the global vaccine apartheid that we have been seeing is something we knew about like basically from the beginning when the vaccines were first rolling out, okay? When you have private corporations whose only incentive is to turn a profit, that goes directly against the ideal goal of actually eradicating the pandemic, of actually saving lives, because they're going to prioritize their bottom line, their money that is going to inevitably end up in the hands of their shareholders and executives. They're going to prioritize that over public health. So it doesn't make sense in any capacity, not just with the vaccines, and we're going to talk about the TRIPS waiver a little bit, but not even just with the vaccines, but just in general, it doesn't make sense to have a profit motive in healthcare or in the pharmaceutical industries, and we see the consequences of having that profit motive, as we're going to discuss right here. So here we go. Insulated from the patent waivers, Pfizer and Moderna decide to hike their vaccine prices. Capitalism never fails to surprise, wrote one observer. So here are the details. In its new supply contract with the EU, Pfizer named a price of more than $23 per dose, up nearly 25% from about $18 on earlier purchases. Moderna said its latest agreement that its mRNA vaccine will cost 1/10 more than its previous price, charging $25.50 per dose. So the two companies plan to provide the EU with 2.1 billion vaccine doses until 2023 and are already expected to rake in tens of billions of dollars this year from vaccine sales. I covered a story a couple months back that I think there was like 19 new vaccine billionaires that have been created over the course of the pandemic from these vaccines. Okay, so basically we have a couple people, a handful of people, a handful of corporations who are making literally billions and billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars off of the suffering of the entire developing world that can't get access to these vaccines because they're being price gouged by these private pharmaceutical companies. Meanwhile, we have entire countries, and thankfully Joe Biden nominally supports waiving the vaccine patents now, but we still have entire countries like Germany, like the UK, that are still opposing getting rid of these vaccine patents and are holding up this entire global production process so that all of these other countries could get access to them for significantly cheaper prices. So we have a handful of wealthy imperialist nations that are price gouging the rest of the world and costing how many lives? Millions of lives potentially into the future, basically at the behest of these big pharmaceutical companies and the profits that they are going to be continuing to make. So according to the New York Times latest analysis, here's where the developing world is. 0.3% of doses have been administered in low-income countries. Leading public health experts warn that COVID-19 will continue to mutate, and dangerous, highly infectious variants like the Delta will continue to emerge and spread throughout the world. And the companies are raising their prices just in time for the Delta variant, one observer wrote on Twitter. Very coincidental there. But I mean, listen, this 0.3% number, I've seen other estimates that estimate like the entire continent of Africa will not reach even close to herd immunity or whatever that even means anymore, will not even be close to vaccinating their entire populations until like 2070. So we're not even close to being on track here, right? And they have these programs through the World Trade Organization like the COVAX initiative, which was supposed to be all of these wealthy nations donating a bunch of their vaccines. It's been a complete failure. As you see there, 0.3% of the doses have been going to low-income countries. So it's only the wealthiest of wealthy countries that are getting access to the vaccines. And that does not just come at the consequence of the poorer countries. Like they just pointed out here, it comes at the consequence of all of us. Because if you just let COVID continue to spread, even if you don't give a shit, about the millions of lives that are potentially at stake here, even if you don't give a shit about the humanitarian cost of this, the economic consequences of this will be the entire rest of the world, which the United States in our imperialist economic situation, we rely on a lot of labor from these places. We rely on their economies functioning just like we rely on our own economies functioning. These are intertwined effects and consequences that will come from having an intertwined global economic system. You can't just ignore a rampaging pandemic in all of Africa and Southeast Asia. You can't just pretend like that doesn't exist, because it will continue to have economic consequences in their own country, continuing to have the humanitarian consequences with, millions of lives potentially being lost unnecessarily at the behest of big pharmaceutical profits. And on top of the economic and the humanitarian side of it, from a public health side of it, there, as I just pointed out there, you're going to continue seeing new variants like the Delta variant, and inevitably there will be worse variants that pop up that are even more infectious, that are even maybe vaccine resistant, that will continue popping up as long as we let COVID continue to spread all over the world. So it doesn't make sense from any single angle, unless the angle is, how can I best allow Pfizer and Moderna to price gouge the entire world and make billions of dollars off of it? That's the only angle that it even makes sense to make an argument for protecting these vaccine patents, and yet that's what's happening. Why? Because because pretty much all of our wealthy Western imperialist countries, whether it's in the EU or whether it's here in the United States, they are bought, owned, and controlled by these big pharmaceutical companies. So they are terrified to challenge them on this. But they continue on here with some of the details as to how much money they're making. With the two companies continuing to sell most of its supply to high-income countries, Pfizer's sales are now expected to reach 56 billion, and Moderna's are expected to reach 30 billion. So tens of billions of dollars is being shoveled into the pockets of these executives, these shareholders at these gigantic pharmaceutical companies that are price gouging the rest of the world. And the consequences are just going to continue to happen. And listen, I pointed out in my tweet here because this is really the main point that I want to get across in this video. You know, we can keep hammering home the same points. It's very obvious what the arguments for releasing the vaccine patents actually are. They continue to be the same as they were, again, at the beginning of the fucking pandemic. Nothing has changed. Same arguments still are valid. But as I point out in my tweet here, the current business model of COVID is private pharma companies price gouging poor countries, denying them vaccines while guaranteeing new variants will emerge that will require more profitable boosters indefinitely. Not great. Nationalize pharma. So that is the end solution here. Get the profit motive out of our pharmaceutical production, period. Not just with COVID, but in all medicines that we are producing. There's a reason why Americans have to pay 50 times more for insulin than people in Canada do. Well, it's because we don't have drug negotiations with these big pharmaceutical companies. The same general idea applies at a global scale. We should be nationalizing our pharmaceutical production. It would be more efficient. It could lead to more innovation because we are not hampered by having to use money on stock buybacks and executive bonuses. We could actually invest in research and development. It would increase investments in research and development. And in addition to that, it would not require price gouging the entire rest of the world in order to solve a public health crisis. So this is a situation that we have right now. It looks like we're going to have all of these big pharmaceutical companies, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, they like the fact that COVID is continuing to spread. They have an incentive to allow for COVID to continue to spread. They have an incentive to allow for new variants to pop up so that they can produce new booster shots that they can then go price gouge the rest of the world for. So you understand the dynamic that is actually unfolding right here. We're pretending continuously as if we are making progress on this pandemic. And listen, we've made decent progress here in the United States with a substantial portion of our population being vaccinated. It looks like there's still a lot of people that won't. But this is the situation that we have right now. COVID is not going anywhere. On the global stage, we're worse off now in terms of where COVID is at than at any point during 2020. So even though we are seeing progress here in the United States nominally, the rest of the world is not seeing that progress, and it's because of us. It is because of these wealthy Western imperialist nations that are siding with the profits and choosing the profits of big pharmaceutical companies instead of saving millions of lives and actually getting past COVID. So we're going to continue to see these booster shots come out. And listen, none of this is me saying the vaccines don't work, okay? You can simultaneously believe the science that the vaccines do in fact work and also understand the perverse incentives within having a for-profit pharmaceutical industry. So it's a ridiculous situation that we have, and it will continue indefinitely into the future until we relinquish the IP for these patents and for these vaccine patents and allow the entire world to ramp up production so we can actually move past COVID. But until that happens, we're going to keep seeing variants pop up. We're going to keep seeing poorer nations denied access to vaccines, and we're not going to be able to move past COVID as a global community.